My dear Lord, where Maoris are concerned, distrust is safer than confidence. I do not know on what terms they are with the English, whether the insurrection is suppressed or successful, or whether indeed the war may not be going on with full vigor. Modesty apart, people like us would be a prize, and I must say, I would rather forgo a taste of Maori hospitality. I think it certainly more prudent to avoid this village of Ngarnavahia, to skirt it at a distance, so as to avoid all encounters with the natives. When we reach Drury, it will be another thing, and there our brave ladies will be able to recruit their strength at their leisure. This advice prevailed. Lady Helena preferred to pass another night in the open air and not to expose her companions to danger. Neither Mary Grant or she wished to halt, and they continued their march along the river. 2 hours later, the first shades of evening began to fall. The sun, before disappearing below the western horizon, darted some bright rays through an opening in the clouds. The distant eastern summits were empurpled with the parting glories of the day. It was like a flying salute addressed to the way-worn travelers. Glenarvan and his friends hastened their steps. They knew how short the twilight is in this high latitude, and how quickly the night follows it. They were very anxious to reach the confluence of the two rivers before the darkness overtook them. But a thick fog rose from the ground and made it very difficult to see the way. Fortunately, hearing stood them in the stead of sight. Shortly, a nearer sound of water indicated that the confluence was at hand. At 8 o'clock, the little troop arrived at the point where the Waipa loses itself in the Waikato, with a moaning sound of meeting waves. "There is the Waikato," cried Paganel, "and the road to Auckland is along its right bank." "We shall see that tomorrow," said the Major. "Let us camp here. It seems to me that that dark shadow is that of a little clump of trees grown expressly to shelter us. Let us have supper and then get some sleep." "Supper by all means," said Paganel, "but no fire, nothing but biscuit and dried meat. We have reached this spot incognito, let us try and get away in the same manner. By good luck, the fog is in our favor." The clump of trees was reached, and all concurred in the wish of the geographer. The cold supper was eaten without a sound, and presently a profound sleep overcame the travelers, who were tolerably fatigued with their 15 miles' march. Chapter 9: Introduction to the Cannibals. The next morning at daybreak, a thick fog was clinging to the surface of the river. A portion of the vapors that saturated the air were condensed by the cold and lay as a dense cloud on the water. But the rays of the sun soon broke through the watery mass and melted it away. A tongue of land, sharply pointed and bristling with bushes, projected into the uniting streams. The swifter waters of the Waipa rushed against the current of the Waikato for a quarter of a mile before they mingled with it. But the calm and majestic river soon quieted the noisy stream and carried it off quietly in its course to the Pacific Ocean. When the vapor disappeared, a boat was seen ascending the current of the Waikato. It was a canoe 70 feet long, 5 broad, and 3 deep, the prow raised like that of a Venetian gondola, and the whole hollowed out of a trunk of a kikatea. A bed of dry fern was laid at the bottom. It was swiftly rowed by 8 oars and steered with a paddle by a man seated in the stern. This man was a tall Maori, about 45 years of age, broad-chested, muscular, with powerfully developed hands and feet. His prominent and deeply furrowed brow, his fierce look, and sinister expression gave him a formidable aspect. Tattooing, or moko, as the New Zealanders call it, is a mark of great distinction. None is worthy of these honorary lines who has not distinguished himself in repeated fights. The slaves and the lower class cannot obtain this decoration. Chiefs of high position may be known by the finish and precision and truth of the design, which sometimes covers their whole bodies with the figures of animals. Some are found to undergo the painful operation of moko 5 times. The more illustrious, the more illustrated, is the rule of New Zealand. Dumont 500 Erville has given some curious details as to this custom. He justly observes that moko is the counterpart of the armorial bearings of which many families in Europe are so vain, but he remarks that there is this difference. The armorial bearings of Europe are frequently a proof only of the merits of the first who bore them, and are no certificate of the merits of his descendants, while the individual coat of arms of the Maori is an irrefragable proof that it was earned by the display of extraordinary personal courage. The practice of tattooing, independently of the consideration it procures, has also a useful aspect. It gives the cutaneous system an increased thickness, enabling it to resist the inclemency of the season and the incessant attacks of the mosquito. As to the chief who was steering the canoe, there could be no mistake. The sharpened albatross bone used by the Maori tattooer had 5 times scored his countenance. He was in his 5th edition, and betrayed it in his haughty bearing. His figure, draped in a large mat woven of formium, trimmed with dogskins, was clothed with a pair of cotton drawers, blood-stained from recent combats. From the pendant lobe of his ears hung earrings of green jade, and round his neck a quivering necklace of pounamus, a kind of jade stone sacred among the New Zealanders. At his side lay an English rifle and a padu-padu, a kind of two-headed axe of an emerald color and 18 inches long. Beside him sat 9 armed warriors of inferior rank, ferocious-looking fellows, some of them suffering from recent wounds. They sat quite motionless, wrapped in their flax mantles. 3 savage-looking dogs lay at their feet. The 8 rowers in the prow seemed to be servants or slaves of the chief. They rowed vigorously and propelled the boat against the not very rapid current of the Waikato with extraordinary velocity. In the center of this long canoe, with their feet tied together, sat 10 European prisoners closely packed together. It was Glenarvan and Lady Helena, Mary Grant, Robert Paganel, the major, John Mangles, the steward, and the 2 sailors. The night before, the little band had unwittingly, owing to the mist, encamped in the midst of a numerous party of natives. Toward the middle of the night they were surprised in their sleep, were made prisoners, and carried on board the canoe. They had not been ill-treated so far, but all attempts at resistance had been vain. Their arms and ammunition were in the hands of the savages, and they would soon have been targets for their own balls. They were soon aware, from a few English words used by the natives, that they were a retreating party of the tribe who had been beaten and decimated by the English troops, and were on their way back to the upper Waikato. The Maori chief, whose principal warriors had been picked off by the soldiers of the 42nd Regiment, was returning to make a final appeal to the tribes of the Waikato district, so that he might go to the aid of the indomitable William Thompson, who was still holding his own against the conquerors. The chief's name was Kaikumu, a name of evil boding in the native language, meaning, he who eats the limbs of his enemy. He was bold and brave, but his cruelty was equally remarkable. No pity was to be expected at his hands. His name was well known to the English soldiers, and a price had been set on his head by the governor of New Zealand. This terrible blow befell Glenarvan at the very moment when he was about to reach the long-desired haven of Auckland, and so regain his own country. But no one who looked at his cool, calm features could have guessed the anguish he endured. Glenarvan always rose to his misfortunes. He felt that his part was to be the strength and the example of his wife and companions, that he was the head and chief, ready to die for the rest if circumstances required it. He was of a deeply religious turn of mind, and never lost his trust in Providence nor his belief in the sacred character of his enterprise. In the midst of this crowning peril, he did not give way to any feeling of regret at having been induced to venture into this country of savages. His companions were worthy of him. They entered into his lofty views, and judging by their haughty demeanor, it would scarcely have been supposed that they were hurrying to the final catastrophe. With one accord, and by Glenarvan's advice, they resolved to affect utter indifference before the natives. It was the only way to impress these ferocious natures. Savages in general, and particularly the Maoris, have a notion of dignity from which they never derogate. They respect, above all things, coolness and courage. Glenarvan was aware that by this mode of procedure, he and his companions would spare themselves needless humiliation. From the moment of embarking, the natives, who were very taciturn, like all savages, had scarcely exchanged a word, but from the few sentences they did utter, Glenarvan felt certain that the English language was familiar to them. He therefore made up his mind to question the chief on the fate that awaited them. Addressing himself to Kaikumu, he said in a perfectly unconcerned voice, "Where are we going, chief?" Kaikumu looked coolly at him and made no answer. "What are you going to do with us?" pursued Glenarvan. A sudden gleam flashed into the eyes of Kaikumu, and he said in a deep voice, "Exchange you if your own people care to have you, eat you if they don't." Glenarvan asked no further questions, but hope revived in his heart. He concluded that some Maori chiefs had fallen into the hands of the English, and that the natives would try to get them exchanged. So they had a chance of salvation, and the case was not quite so desperate. The canoe was speeding rapidly up the river. Paganel, whose excitable temperament always rebounded from one extreme to the other, had quite regained his spirits. He consoled himself that the natives were saving them the trouble of the journey to the English outposts, and that was so much gain. So he took it quite quietly and followed on the map the course of the Waikato across the plains and valleys of the province. Lady Helena and Mary Grant, concealing their alarm, conversed in a low voice with Glenarvan, and the keenest physiognomists would have failed to see any anxiety in their faces. The Waikato is the national river in New Zealand. It is to the Maoris what the Rhine is to the Germans and the Danube to the Slavs. In its course of 200 miles, it waters the finest lands of the North Island, from the province of Wellington to the province of Auckland. It gave its name to all those indomitable tribes of the river district, which rose en masse against the invaders. The waters of this river are still almost strangers to any craft but the native canoe. The most audacious tourist will scarcely venture to invade these sacred shores. In fact, the upper Waikato is sealed against profane Europeans. Paganel was aware of the feelings of veneration with which the natives regard this great arterial stream. He knew that the English and German naturalists had never penetrated further than its junction with the Waipa. He wondered how far the good pleasure of Kaikumu would carry his captives. He could not have guessed, but for hearing the word Taupo repeatedly uttered between the chief and his warriors. He consulted his map and saw that Taupo was the name of a lake celebrated in geographical annals and lying in the most mountainous part of the island, at the southern extremity of Auckland Province. The Waikato passes through this lake and then flows on for 120 miles. Chapter 10: A Momentous Interview. An unfathomable gulf 25 miles long and 20 miles broad was produced, but long before historic times, by the falling in of caverns among the trachytic lavas of the center of the island. And these waters falling from the surrounding heights have taken possession of this vast basin. The gulf has become a lake, but it is also an abyss, and no lead line has yet sounded its depths. Such is the wondrous Lake of Taupo, lying 1,250 feet above the level of the sea, and in view of an amphitheater of mountains 2,400 feet high. On the west are rocky peaks of great size, on the north lofty summits clothed with low trees, on the east a broad beach with a road track, and covered with pumice stones, which shimmer through the leafy screen of the bushes. On the southern side rise volcanic cones behind a forest flat. Such is the majestic frame that encloses this vast sheet of water, whose roaring tempests rival the cyclones of ocean. The whole region boils like an immense cauldron hung over subterranean fires. The ground vibrates from the agitation of the central furnace. Hot springs filter out everywhere. The crust of the earth cracks in great rifts like a cake, too quickly baked. About a quarter of a mile off, on a craggy spur of the mountain stood a pa, or Maori fortress. The prisoners, whose feet and hands were liberated, were landed one by one and conducted into it by the warriors. The path which led up to the entrenchment lay across fields of phormium and a grove of beautiful trees, the caicadias with persistent leaves and red berries, Dracaenas australis, the tea trees of the natives, whose crown is a graceful counterpart of the cabbage palm, and huias, which are used to give a black dye to cloth. Large doves with metallic sheen on their plumage, and a world of starlings with reddish carmels flew away at the approach of the natives. After a rather circuitous walk, Glenarvan and his party arrived at the pa. The fortress was defended by an outer enclosure of strong palisades, 15 feet high, a second line of stakes, then a fence composed of osiers with loopholes enclosed Verne the inner space, that is the plateau of the pa, on which were erected the Maori buildings, and about 40 huts arranged symmetrically. When the captives approached, they were horror-struck at the sight of the heads which adorned the posts of the inner circle. Lady Helena and Mary Grant turned away their eyes more with disgust than with terror. These heads were those of hostile chiefs who had fallen in battle and whose bodies had served to feed the conquerors. The geographer recognized that it was so, from their eye sockets being hollow and deprived of eyeballs. Glenarvan and his companions had taken in all this scene at a glance. They stood near an empty house, waiting the pleasure of the chief, and exposed to the abuse of a crowd of old crones. This troop of harpies surrounded them, shaking their fists, howling and vociferating. Some English words that escaped their coarse mouths left no doubt that they were clamoring for immediate vengeance. In the midst of all these cries and threats, Lady Helena, tranquil to all outward seeming, affected an indifference she was far from feeling. This courageous woman made heroic efforts to restrain herself, lest she should disturb Glenarvan's coolness. Poor Mary Grant felt her heart sink within her, and John Mangles stood by ready to die in her behalf. His companions bore the deluge of invectives, each according to his disposition, the major with utter indifference, Paganel with exasperation that increased every moment. Glenarvan, to spare Lady Helena the attacks of these witches, walked straight up to Kaikumu and pointing to the hideous group. "Send them away," said he. The Maori chief stared fixedly at his prisoner without speaking, and then, with a nod, he silenced the noisy horde. Glenarvan bowed as a sign of thanks and went slowly back to his place. At this moment 100 Maoris were assembled in the pa. Old men, full-grown men, youths. The former were calm, but gloomy, awaiting the orders of Kaikumu. The others gave themselves up to the most violent sorrow, bewailing their parents and friends who had fallen in the late engagements. Kaikumu was the only one of all the chiefs that obeyed the call of William Thompson, who had returned to the Lake District, and he was the first to announce to his tribe the defeat of the national insurrection, beaten on the plains of the lower Waikato. Of the 200 warriors who, under his orders, hastened to the defense of the soil, 150 were missing on his return. Allowing for a number being made prisoners by the invaders, how many must be lying on the field of battle, never to return to the country of their ancestors? This was the secret of the outburst of grief with which the tribe saluted the arrival of Kaikumu. Up to that moment, nothing had been known of the last defeat, and the fatal news fell on them like a thunderclap. Among the savages, sorrow is always manifested by physical signs. The parents and friends of deceased warriors, the women especially, lacerated their faces and shoulders with sharpened shells. The blood spurted out and blended with their tears. Deep wounds denoted great despair. The unhappy Maoris, bleeding and excited, were hideous to look upon. There was another serious element in their grief. Not only had they lost the relative or friend they mourned, but his bones would be missing in the family mausoleum. In the Maori religion, the possession of these relics is regarded as indispensable to the destinies of the future life. Not the perishable flesh, but the bones, which are collected with the greatest care, cleaned, scraped, polished, even varnished, and then deposited in the audupa. That is the house of glory. These tombs are adorned with wooden statues, representing with perfect exactness the tattoo of the deceased. But now their tombs would be left empty, the religious rites would be unsolemnized, and the bones that escaped the teeth of the wild dog would whiten without burial on the field of battle. Then the sorrowful chorus redoubled. The menaces of the women were intensified by the imprecations of the men against the Europeans. Abusive epithets were lavished, the accompanying gestures became more violent. The howl was about to end in brutal action. Kaikumu, fearing that he might be overpowered by the fanatics of his tribe, conducted his prisoners to a sacred place, on an abruptly raised plateau at the other end of the pa. This hut rested against a mound elevated 100 feet above it, which formed the steep outer buttress of the entrenchment. In this Weratwa, sacred house, the priests or Arakis taught the Maoris about a triune god, father, son, and bird or spirit. The large, well-constructed hut contained the sacred and choice food which Maui-Rangarangui eats by the mouths of his priests. In this place, and safe for the moment from the frenzied natives, the captives lay down on the flax mats. Lady Helena was quite exhausted, her moral energies prostrate, and she fell helpless into her husband's arms. Glenarvan pressed her to his bosom and said, "Courage, my dear Helena, heaven will not forsake us." Robert was scarcely in when he jumped on Wilson's shoulders and squeezed his head through a crevice left between the roof and the walls, from which chaplets of amulets were hung. From that elevation he could see the whole extent of the pa and as far as Kaikumu's house. "They are all crowding round the chief," said he softly. "They are throwing their arms about. They are howling. Kaikumu is trying to speak." Then he was silent for a few minutes. "Kaikumu is speaking. The savages are quieter. They are listening." "Evidently," said the major, "this chief has a personal interest in protecting us. He wants to exchange his prisoners for some chiefs of his tribe, but will his warriors consent?" "Yes, they are listening. They have dispersed, some are gone into their huts, the others have left the entrenchment." "Are you sure?" said the major. "Yes, Mr. McNabbs," replied Robert. "Kaikumu is left alone with the warriors of his canoe. Oh, one of them is coming up here." "Come down, Robert," said Glenarvan. At this moment, Lady Helena, who had risen, seized her husband's arm. "Edward," she said in a resolute tone, "neither Mary Grant nor I must fall into the hands of these savages alive." And so saying, she handed Glenarvan a loaded revolver. "Firearm!" exclaimed Glenarvan with flashing eyes. Yes, the Maoris do not search their prisoners, but Edward, this is for us, not for them. Glenarvan slipped the revolver under his coat. At the same moment, the mat at the entrance was raised, and a native entered. He motioned to the prisoners to follow him. Glenarvan and the rest walked across the pa and stopped before Kaikumu. He was surrounded by the principal warriors of his tribe, and among them the Maori whose canoe joined that of the Kaikumu at the confluence of Pohinhena on the Waikato. He was a man about 40 years of age, powerfully built and of fierce and cruel aspect. His name was Karatit, meaning the irascible in the native tongue. Kaikumu treated him with a certain tone of respect, and by the fineness of his tattoo, it was easy to perceive that Karatit held a lofty position in the tribe, but a keen observer would have guessed the feeling of rivalry that existed between these two chiefs. The major observed that the influence of Karatit gave umbrage to Kaikumu. They both ruled the Waikato tribes and were equal in authority. During this interview, Kaikumu smiled, but his eyes betrayed a deep-seated enmity. Kaikumu interrogated Glenarvan. "You are English," said he. "Yes," replied Glenarvan, unhesitatingly, as his nationality would facilitate the exchange. "And your companions," said Kaikumu. "My companions are English like myself. We are shipwrecked travelers, but it may be important to state that we have taken no part in the war." "That matters little," was the brutal answer of Karatit. "Every Englishman is an enemy. Your people invaded our island, they robbed our fields, they burned our villages." "They were wrong," said Glenarvan quietly. "I say so because I think it, not because I am in your power." "Listen," said Kaikumu. "The Tohunga, the chief priest of New Yatwa, has fallen into the hands of your brethren. He is a prisoner among the Pakegas. Our deity has commanded us to ransom him. For my own part, I would rather have torn out your heart. I would have stuck your head, and those of your companions, on the posts of that palisade. But New Yatwa has spoken." As he uttered these words, Kaikumu, who till now had been quite unmoved, trembled with rage, and his features expressed intense ferocity. Then, after a few minutes' interval, he proceeded more calmly. "Do you think the English will exchange you for our Tohunga?" Glenarvan hesitated, all the while watching the Maori chief. "I do not know," said he, after a moment of silence. "Speak," returned Kaikumu. "Is your life worth that of our Tohunga?" "No," replied Glenarvan. "I am neither a chief nor a priest among my own people." Paganel, petrified at this reply, looked at Glenarvan in amazement. Kaikumu appeared equally astonished. "You doubt it then," said he. "I do not know," replied Glenarvan. "Your people will not accept you as an exchange for Tohunga." "Me alone, no," repeated Glenarvan. "All of us perhaps they might." "Our Maori custom," replied Kaikumu, "is head for head." "Offer first these ladies in exchange for your priest," said Glenarvan, pointing to Lady Helena and Mary Grant. Lady Helena was about to interrupt him, but the Major held her back. "Those two ladies," continued Glenarvan, bowing respectfully toward Lady Helena and Mary Grant, "are personages of rank in their own country." The warrior gazed coldly at his prisoner. An evil smile relaxed his lips for a moment, then he controlled himself, and in a voice of ill-concealed anger. "Do you hope to deceive Kaikumu with lying words, accursed Pekka? Cannot the eyes of Kaikumu red hearts?" And pointing to Lady Helena, "That is your wife," he said. "No, mine," exclaimed Karatit. And then pushing his prisoners aside, he laid his hand on the shoulder of Lady Helena, who turned pale at his touch. "Edward," cried the unfortunate woman in terror. Glenarvan, without a word, raised his arm, a shot, and Karatit fell at his feet. The sound brought a crowd of natives to the spot. 100 arms were ready, and Glenarvan's revolver was snatched from him. Kaikumu glanced at Glenarvan with a curious expression. Then, with one hand protecting Glenarvan, with the other he waved off the crowd who were rushing on the party. At last, his voice was heard above the tumult. "Taboo, taboo," he shouted. At that word the crowd stood still before Glenarvan and his companions, who for the time were preserved by a supernatural influence. A few minutes after they were reconducted to Whereatwa, which was their prison, but Robert, Grant, and Paganel were not with them. Chapter 11: The Chiefess Funeral. Kaikumu, as frequently happens among the Maoris, joined the title of Ariki to that of tribal chief. He was invested with the dignity of priest, and, as such, he had the power to throw over persons or things the superstitious protection of the taboo. The taboo, which is common to all the Polynesian races, has the primary effect of isolating the tabooed person and preventing the use of tabooed things. According to the Maori doctrine, anyone who laid sacrilegious hands on what had been declared taboo would be punished with death by the insulted deity. And even if the god delayed the vindication of his power, the priests took care to accelerate his vengeance. By the chiefs, the taboo is made a political engine, except in some cases for domestic reasons. For instance, a native is tabooed for several days when his hair is cut, when he is tattooed, when he is building a canoe or a house, when he is seriously ill, and when he is dead. If excessive consumption threatens to exterminate the fish of a river or ruin the early crop of sweet potatoes, these things are put under the protection of the taboo. If a chief wishes to clear his house of hangers-on, he taboos it. If an English trader displeases him, he is tabooed. His interdict has the effect of the old royal veto. If an object is tabooed, no one can touch it with impunity. When a native is under the interdict, certain aliments are denied him for a prescribed period. If he is relieved, as regards the severe diet, his slaves feed him with the viands he is forbidden to touch with his hands. If he is poor and has no slaves, he has to take up the food with his mouth, like an animal. In short, the most trifling acts of the Maoris are directed and modified by this singular custom. The deity is brought into constant contact with their daily life. The taboo has the same weight as a law, or rather, the code of the Maoris, indisputable and undisputed, is comprised in the frequent applications of the taboo. As to the prisoners confined in the Weratwa, it was an arbitrary taboo which had saved them from the fury of the tribe. Some of the natives, friends and partisans of Kaikumu, desisted at once on hearing their chief's voice and protected the captives from the rest. Glenarvan cherished no elusive hopes as to his own fate. Nothing but his death could atone for the murder of a chief, and among these people death was only the concluding act of a martyrdom of torture. Glenarvan, therefore, was fully prepared to pay the penalty of the righteous indignation that nerved his arm, but he hoped that the wrath of Kaikumu would not extend beyond himself. What a night he and his companions passed. Who could picture their agonies or measure their sufferings? Robert and Paganel had not been restored to them, but their fate was no doubtful matter. They were too surely the first victims of the frenzied natives. Even McNabbs, who was always sanguine, had abandoned hope. John Mangles was nearly frantic at the sight of Mary Grant's despair at being separated from her brother. Glenarvan pondered over the terrible request of Lady Helena, who preferred dying by his hand to submitting to torture and slavery. How was he to summon the terrible courage? And Mary, who has a right to strike her dead, thought John, whose heart was broken. Escape was clearly impossible. 10 warriors, armed to the teeth, kept watch at the door of Weratwa. The morning of February 13th arrived. No communication had taken place between the natives and the tabooed prisoners. A limited supply of provisions was in the house, which the unhappy inmates scarcely touched. Misery deadened the pangs of hunger. The day passed without change, and without hope. The funeral ceremonies of the dead chief would doubtless be the signal for their execution. Although Glenarvan did not conceal from himself the probability that Kaikumu had given up all idea of exchange, the major still cherished a spark of hope. "Who knows," said he, as he reminded Glenarvan of the effect produced on the chief by the death of Karateet. "Who knows but that Kaikumu, in his heart, is very much obliged to you?" But even McNabb's remarks failed to awaken hope in Glenarvan's mind. The next day passed without any appearance of preparation for their punishment, and this was the reason of the delay. The Maoris believe that for 3 days after death the soul inhabits the body, and therefore, for 3 times 24 hours, the corpse remains unburied. This custom was rigorously observed. Till February 15th, the pa was deserted. John Mangles, hoisted on Wilson's shoulders, frequently reconnoitered the outer defenses. Not a single native was visible, only the watchful sentinels relieving guard at the door of the Weratwa. But on the 3rd day the huts opened. All the savages, men, women, and children in all several hundred Maoris, assembled in the pa, silent and calm. Kaikumu came out of his house, and surrounded by the principal chiefs of his tribe, he took his stand on a mound some feet above the level, in the center of the enclosure. The crowd of natives formed in a half-circle some distance off, in dead silence. At a sign from Kaikumu, A warrior bent his steps toward Whereatwa. "Remember," said Lady Helena to her husband. Glenarvan pressed her to his heart, and Mary Grant went closer to John Mangles and said hurriedly, "Lord and Lady Glenarvan cannot but think if a wife may claim death at her husband's hands to escape a shameful life, a betrothed wife may claim death at the hands of her betrothed husband to escape the same fate. John, at this last moment I ask you, have we not long been betrothed to each other in our secret hearts? May I rely on you, as Lady Helena relies on Lord Glenarvan?" "Mary," cried the young captain in his despair. "Ah, dear Mary." The mat was lifted, and the captives led to Kaikumu. The two women were resigned to their fate. The men dissembled their sufferings with superhuman effort. They arrived in the presence of the Maori chief. "You killed Karatit," said he to Glenarvan. "I did," answered Glenarvan. "You die tomorrow at sunrise." "Alone?" asked Glenarvan with a beating heart. "Oh, if our Tohunga's life was not more precious than yours," exclaimed Kaikumu with a ferocious expression of regret. At this moment there was a commotion among the natives. Glenarvan looked quickly around, the crowd made way, and a warrior appeared heated by running and sinking with fatigue. Kaikumu, as soon as he saw him, said in English, evidently for the benefit of the captives, "You come from the camp of the Paikas?" "Yes," answered the Maori. "You have seen the prisoner, our Tohunga?" "I have seen him." "Alive?" "Dead, English have shot him." It was all over with Glenarvan and his companions. "All," cried Kaikumu, "you all die tomorrow at daybreak." Punishment fell on all indiscriminately. Lady Helena and Mary Grant were grateful to heaven for the boon. The captives were not taken back to Whereatwa. They were destined to attend the obsequies of the chief and the bloody rites that accompanied them. A guard of natives conducted them to the foot of an immense kauri, and then stood on guard without taking their eyes off the prisoners. The 3 prescribed days had elapsed since the death of Karatit, and the soul of the dead warrior had finally departed, so the ceremonies commenced. The body was laid on a small mound in the central enclosure. It was clothed in a rich dress and wrapped in a magnificent flax mat. His head, adorned with feathers, was encircled with a crown of green leaves. His face, arms, and chest had been rubbed with oil and did not show any sign of decay. The parents and friends arrived at the foot of the mound, and at a certain moment, as if the leader of an orchestra were leading a funeral chant, there arose a great wail of tears, sighs, and sobs. They lamented the deceased with a plaintive rhythm and doleful cadence. The kinsmen beat their heads, the kinswomen tore their faces with their nails and lavished more blood than tears. But these demonstrations were not sufficient to propitiate the soul of the deceased, whose wrath might strike the survivors of his tribe, and his warriors, as they could not recall him to life, were anxious that he should have nothing to wish for in the other world. The wife of Karatit was not to be parted from him. Indeed, she would have refused to survive him. It was a custom, as well as a duty, and Maori history has no lack of such sacrifices. This woman came on the scene. She was still young. Her disheveled hair flowed over her shoulders. Her sobs and cries filled the air. Incoherent words, regrets, sobs, broken phrases in which she extolled the virtues of the dead, alternated with her moans, and in a crowning paroxysm of sorrow, she threw herself at the foot of the mound and beat her head on the earth. The Kaikumu drew near. Suddenly the wretched victim rose, but a violent blow from a mere, a kind of club brandished by the chief, struck her to the ground. She fell senseless. Horrible yells followed. 100 arms threatened the terror-stricken captives. But no one moved, for the funeral ceremonies were not yet over. The wife of Karatit had joined her husband. The 2 bodies lay stretched side by side, but in the future life, even the presence of his faithful companion was not enough. Who would attend on them in the realm of New Yatwa if their slaves did not follow them into the other world? 6 unfortunate fellows were brought to the mound. They were attendants whom the pitiless usages of war had reduced to slavery. During the chief's lifetime, they had borne the severest privations and been subjected to all kinds of ill usage. They had been scantily fed and incessantly occupied like beasts of burden, and now, according to Maori ideas, they were to resume to all eternity this life of bondage. These poor creatures appeared quite resigned to their destiny. They were not taken by surprise. Their unbound hands showed that they met their fate without resistance. Their death was speedy and not aggravated by tedious suffering. Torture was reserved for the authors of the murder, who, only 20 paces off, averted their eyes from the horrible scene which was to grow yet more horrible. 6 blows of the mere, delivered by the hands of 6 powerful warriors, felled the victims in the midst of a sea of blood. This was the signal for a fearful scene of cannibalism. The bodies of slaves are not protected by taboo like those of their masters. They belonged to the tribe. They were a sort of small change thrown among the mourners, and the moment the sacrifice was over, the whole crowd, chiefs, warriors, old men, women, children without distinction of age or sex, fell upon the senseless remains with brutal appetite. Faster than a rapid pen could describe it, the bodies, still reeking, were dismembered, divided, cut up, not into morsels, but into crumbs. Of the 200 Maoris present, everyone obtained a share. They fought, they struggled, they quarreled over the smallest fragment. The drops of hot blood splashed over these festive monsters, and the whole of this detestable crew groveled under a rain of blood. It was like the delirious fury of tigers fighting over their prey, or like a circus where the wild beasts devour the deer. This scene ended, a score of fires were lit at various points of the paw. The smell of charred flesh polluted the air, and but for the fearful tumult of the festival, but for the cries that emanated from these flesh-sated throats, the captives might have heard the bones crunching under the teeth of the cannibals. Glenarvan and his companions, breathless with horror, tried to conceal this fearful scene from the eyes of the 2 poor ladies. They understood then what fate awaited them next day at dawn, and also with what cruel torture this death would be preceded. They were dumb with horror. The funeral dances commenced. Strong liquors distilled from the Piper Excelsum animated the intoxication of the natives. They had nothing human left. It seemed possible that the taboo might be forgotten, and they might rush upon the prisoners, who were already terrified at their delirious gestures. But Kaikumu had kept his own senses amidst the general delirium. He allowed an hour for this orgy of blood to attain its maximum and then cease, and the final scene of the obsequies was performed with the accustomed ceremonial. The corpses of Karatit and his wife were raised, the limbs were bent, and laid against the stomach according to the Maori usage. Then came the funeral, not the final interment, but a burial until the moment when the earth had destroyed the flesh, and nothing remained but the skeleton. The place of Audupa, or the tomb, had been chosen outside the fortress, about 2 miles off at the top of a low hill called Maunganamu, situated on the right bank of the lake, and to this spot the body was to be taken. 2 palanquins of a very primitive kind, hand barrows in fact, were brought to the foot of the mound, and the corpses doubled up so that they were sitting rather than lying, and their garments kept in place by a band of hands were placed on them. 4 warriors took up the litters on their shoulders, and the whole tribe, repeating their funeral chant, followed in procession to the place of sepulture. The captives, still strictly guarded, saw the funeral cordage leave the inner enclosure of the paw. Then the chants and cries grew fainter. For about half an hour the funeral procession remained out of sight, in the hollow valley, and then came in sight again winding up the mountainside. The distance gave a fantastic effect to the undulating movement of this long serpentine column. The tribe stopped at an elevation of about 800 feet, on the summit of Maunganamu, where the burial place of Karatit had been prepared. An ordinary Maori would have had nothing but a hole and a heap of earth. But a powerful and formidable chief destined to speedy deification was honored with a tomb worthy of his exploits. The Audupa had been fenced round, and posts, surmounted with faces painted in red ochre, stood near the grave where the bodies were to lie. The relatives had not forgotten that the Wadwa, the spirit of the dead, lives on mortal food as the body did in this life. Therefore, food was deposited in the enclosure as well as the arms and clothing of the deceased. Nothing was omitted for comfort. The husband and wife were laid side by side, then covered with earth and grass after another series of laments. Then the procession wound slowly down the mountain, and henceforth none dare ascend the slope of Maunganamu on pain of death, for it was tabooed, like Tongariro, where lie the ashes of a chief killed by an earthquake in 1846. Chapter 12, Strangely Liberated. Just as the sun was sinking beyond Lake Taupo, behind the peaks of Tuhahua and Pukapapu, the captives were conducted back to their prison. They were not to leave it again till the tops of the Wahiti ranges were lit with the first fires of day. They had one night in which to prepare for death. Overcome as they were with horror and fatigue, they took their last meal together. "We shall need all our strength," Glenarvan had said, "to look death in the face. We must show these savages how Europeans can die." The meal ended. Lady Helena repeated the evening prayer aloud. Her companions, bareheaded, repeated it after her. Who does not turn his thoughts toward God in the hour of death? This done, the prisoners embraced each other. Mary Grant and Helena, in a corner of the hut, lay down on a mat. Sleep, which keeps all sorrow in abeyance, soon weighed down their eyelids. They slept in each other's arms, overcome by exhaustion and prolonged watching. Then Glenarvan, taking his friends aside, said, "My dear friends, our lives and the lives of these poor women are in God's hands. If it is decreed that we die tomorrow, let us die bravely, like Christian men, ready to appear without terror before the Supreme Judge. God, who reads our hearts, knows that we had a noble end in view. If death awaits us instead of success, it is by his will. Stern as the decree may seem, I will not repine. But death here means not death only, it means torture, insult, perhaps, and here are two ladies." Glenarvan's voice, firm till now, faltered. He was silent a moment, and having overcome his emotion, he said, addressing the young captain, "John, you have promised Mary what I promised Lady Helena. What is your plan?" "I believe," said John, "that in the sight of God I have a right to fulfill that promise." "Yes, John, but we are unarmed." "No," replied John, showing him a dagger. "I snatched it from Karateet when he fell at your feet. My lord, whichever of us survives the other will fulfill the wish of Lady Helena and Mary Grant." After these words were said, a profound silence ensued. At last the major said, "My friends, keep that to the last moment. I am not an advocate of irremediable measures." "I did not speak for ourselves," said Glenarvan. "Be it as it may, we can face death. Had we been alone, I should ere now have cried, 'My friends, let us make an effort. Let us attack these wretches.' But with these poor girls—" At this moment John raised the mat and counted 25 natives keeping guard on the Weratwa. A great fire had been lighted, and its lurid glow threw into strong relief the irregular outlines of the pa. Some of the savages were sitting round the brazier, the others standing motionless, their black outlines relieved against the clear background of flame. But they all kept watchful guard on the hut confided to their care. It has been said that between a vigilant jailer and a prisoner who wishes to escape, the chances are in favor of the prisoner. The fact is, the interest of the one is keener than that of the other. The jailer may forget that he is on guard. The prisoner never forgets that he is guarded. The captive thinks oftener of escaping than the jailer of preventing his flight, and hence we hear of frequent and wonderful escapes. But in the present instance, hatred and revenge were the jailers, not an indifferent warder. The prisoners were not bound, but it was because bonds were useless when 25 men were watching the only egress from the Weratwa. This house, with its back to the rock which closed the fortress, was only accessible by a long, narrow promontory which joined it in front to the plateau on which the pa was erected. On its two other sides rose pointed rocks, which jutted out over an abyss 100 feet deep. On that side descent was impossible, and had it been possible, the bottom was shut in by the enormous rock. The only outlet was the regular door of the Weratwa, and the Maoris guarded the promontory which united it to the pa like a drawbridge. All escape was thus hopeless, and Glenarvan, having tried the walls for the 20th time, was compelled to acknowledge that it was so. The hours of this night, wretched as they were, slipped away. Thick darkness had settled on the mountain. Neither moon nor stars pierced the gloom. Some gusts of wind whistled by the sides of the pa, and the posts of the house creaked. The fire outside revived with the puffs of wind, and the flames sent fitful gleams into the interior of Weratwa. The group of prisoners was lit up for a moment. They were absorbed in their last thoughts, and a death-like silence reigned in the hut. It might have been about 4 o'clock in the morning, when the major's attention was called to a slight noise, which seemed to come from the foundation of the posts in the wall of the hut which abutted on the rock. McNabbs was at first indifferent, but finding the noise continue, he listened. Then his curiosity was aroused, and he put his ear to the ground. It sounded as if someone was scraping or hollowing out the ground outside. As soon as he was sure of it, he crept over to Glenarvan and John Mangles, and startling them from their melancholy thoughts, led them to the end of the hut. "Listen," said he, motioning them to stoop. The scratching became more and more audible. They could hear the little stones grate on a hard body and roll away. "Some animal in his burrow," said John Mangles. Glenarvan struck his forehead. "Who knows?" said he. "It might be a man." "Animal or man," answered the major, "I will soon find out." Wilson and Albinet joined their companions, and all united to dig through the wall, John with his dagger, the others with stones taken from the ground, or with their nails, while Mulready, stretched along the ground, watched the native guard through a crevice of the matting. These savages sitting motionless around the fire suspected nothing of what was going on 20 feet off. The soil was light and friable, and below lay a bed of silicious tufa. Therefore, even without tools, the aperture deepened quickly. It soon became evident that a man or men, clinging to the sides of the pah, were cutting a passage into its exterior wall. What could be the object? Did they know of the existence of the prisoners, or was it some private enterprise that led to the undertaking? The prisoners redoubled their efforts. Their fingers bled, but still they worked on. After half an hour, they had gone 3 feet deep. They perceived by the increased sharpness of the sounds that only a thin layer of earth prevented immediate communication. Some minutes more passed, and the major withdrew his hand from the stroke of a sharp blade. He suppressed a cry. John Mangles, inserting the blade of his poniard, avoided the knife which now protruded above the soil, but seized the hand that wielded it. It was the hand of a woman or child, a European. On neither side had a word been uttered. It was evidently the cue of both sides to be silent. "Is it Robert?" whispered Glenarvan. But softly as the name was breathed, Mary Grant, already awakened by the sounds in the hut, slipped over toward Glenarvan, and seizing the hand, all stained with earth, she covered it with kisses.